recorded on Friday, May 16, 2003 at Waynesville High School Library in Waynesville, Ohio. Today we are interviewing Carl DeSantis, who is residing now in West Milton, Ohio. He was in the U.S. Army and held the rank of First Lieutenant in the Vietnam War. He was born on August 1st, 1946, and was born in Niagara Falls, New York. We welcome today Carl DeSantis to tell us about his experiences.
Well, she gave the introduction there. The actual dates of my service began in August of 1969, which several of you from my classes realize was halfway through graduate school, which was the result of several deferments. Those of you who had to register for the selective service realize at 18 you have to do that by law. In fact, one of you realized that it's $250,000 fine if you don't do that as a federal felony. The process, though, my draft number came up and I was about to be drafted that day and decided there must be a better deal than being a guy in a foxhole within 3 months. And I was already in college, so I chose, can I go into officer training? And so 2 years later, after officer training at Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia, I walked out of there with a second lieutenant rank. And but a year later, something less than a year, I was given orders for Vietnam. I think many of us thought that the war would be over by the time you had 2 or 3 years of service. And of course, now it was not over. So the process of training went into effect stateside, and then they put you on a commercial airplane, and 29 hours later, via Kyoto, Japan, and someplace in Alaska, you end up in Vietnam. And you start off with training. All of us did, whether you're first lieutenant or you're just a buck sergeant or a private. Everybody starts off in training getting acclimated to Vietnam. The heat, the mosquitoes, the bugs, taking malaria pills, which can choke a horse and make most people pretty sick, and learning how to use salt so you don't sweat to death, and drinking the right water, and not eating the food unless you get used to what the Vietnamese prepare. We had good old American food called sea rations. With the Gulf War that we just got done with, the Iraqi war, you heard of MREs. We had the old sea rations and occasionally something better than that, but fortunately many times we got a real meal. The process of training went through several phases before we actually were put in a duty station, which meant training on being sensitive and aware of the enemy, because the enemy wore many disguises. It might be a small child of 6 years old, it might be an old man of 80 years old, although very few of those people live past 40. So you became very conscious, as they did in Iraq this past war, that not everybody was your friend, not everybody was your enemy, but they all looked alike. We also learned very much a lot about the defenses that we were going to be facing. Some of you are maybe familiar with what's called barbed wire, of course, in the farms, but we had concertina wire, which was loaded with razor blades on big circular coils of steel that surrounded our areas, whether we were in combat or whether we were in the rear. And we watched trained former North Vietnamese Viet Cong men wearing nothing but a pair of shorts show how they could sneak through barbed wire, concertina wire, and still get to us. And so we learned that we weren't safe by any means just because we were surrounded by barbed wire or by concertina wire. We learned more of what we use claymores and defense mechanisms, which would fire off, and tracers and so forth if somebody came into our area. We learned all about these things. Don't get on the wrong side of a claymore mine because it's supposed to kill the enemy, not you. All sorts of different things that you'd be aware of. Your training also involved retraining on all the weapons that you'd ever used because you didn't know what you were going to be thrown if you were in fact in combat or what you had to operate. And so then even as a first lieutenant or a private, everybody had to go through those training facilities. Now that was in South Vietnam and mostly around the Saigon initial entrance area for most of us in the south. And eventually we were shipped up to a place called Nha Trang, which was a former resort in South Vietnam. Very beautiful on the South China Sea. Beautiful water, kind of looks like the Bahamas. It had been very beautiful in the French Indochina locations when they actually fought in Vietnam. It wasn't getting very pretty by the use of the GIs after a while. But barracks were everywhere. We had turned basically resort areas into Army use, and Air Force, Army, Navy, and Marines all used the same general facilities. So that was Nha Trang. Then we went to a place called Cam Ranh Bay, which if you ever study Vietnam, that'll be the most famous perhaps because it was one of the largest sections of naval and air power that was concentrated in Cam Bay. Eventually also turned from a resort area to a total military use. We went through more training and then eventually got orders for where you were going to go. And my orders were for a place called Maud Hill. Vietnam, unlike conventional wars prior to that, was a war of rice paddies and mountains. Not conventional forces, even like Iraq, where you went so far, captured a city and held it. You had mountains, and you took a mountain, and we were located on there, and then the actual real fighters, the soldiers that have earned the name to be the tough soldiers, the one that bore it all, were down in the rice paddies below us, 800, 900, 1,000 feet, actually carrying out the face-to-face, hand-to-hand, man-to-man combat, and our role was to protect them on these mountains. This was outside of Da Nang now. Da Nang was the major city in the north part of South Vietnam, just short of the DMZ, the demilitarized zone with North Vietnam. So the next major city would have been Hanoi, north of us. So we were that close to the center of the enemy, Ho Chi Minh and his communist North Vietnamese, and of course the Viet Cong, which were just rebels, guerrilla warfare. That's the war that we learned, guerrilla warfare. We didn't know about guerrilla warfare before that. And that's kind of like taking the Minutemen of the American Revolution, how they fought behind rocks and around trees and snuck up on the British. We had to learn that people did some strange things to shoot you and to set mines and traps that you never expected. So there in Da Nang, our what they call the rear area, all our battalions and brigade support was set up. All the food, supplies, medical, all the clerical works, the typewriters, real typewriters, were all set there. This is pre-computers, of course, for the most part. And that area supplied people to get ready to go out actually on the fire base or out in the actual rice paddies. So people lived back there pretty safely. Unfortunately, that was a place where people also got lazy and lax and had no access to soft marijuana. I call it soft because it wasn't the strength of the marijuana that's around here today. So people took a lot to get high, and then it took a lot of them out in the bush to get their heads squared away again. So some people got into that. Rarely an officer, if he imbibed, was alcohol. He didn't get into the drugs. But eventually helicopters, and you're used to seeing helicopters in Iraq War, which are large Apache helicopters, the big Chinooks, the huge ones with 30 men on them, and they crash and lose a lot of life. Ours were small Hueys, and if you've seen Vietnam movies, most of you have, they had no doors on them. That's because you didn't want anything to hamper getting on or getting off. So centrifugal force, I think, is what actually kept us in the aircraft. They would be loaded with gunners and pilots. As many of us would be jump on these aircraft, landing point back in the rear area at the base, and then flown out to our hill, over the very rice paddies that we would be protecting, and over the very rice paddies that some Viet Cong or North Vietnamese soldier may be waiting to try and knock your helicopter out of the air. You've seen pictures of the evacuation of Vietnam in '74, and you see people clinging to those struts on the part of the helicopters. Well, those were that's what we landed on, and we never had anybody grabbing them in my case. So you're hanging there, basically open. I have pictures of basically my legs over the open air, and you're just out there waiting to get set down and quickly move out in case there's enemy fire. Now again, the films you've seen of actual combat, those men face that all the time. I only faced that when we were taking off and landing, and pretty much the landing was protected because we were landing on a hill, on a mountain. These mountains, 800 feet high, 1,000 feet high, were typically something you might see in the Alleghenies or maybe even down in Brown County in Indiana. They weren't huge mountains. We're talking about big hills, 1,000 feet, 800 feet. But the Air Force would come in first and blow the tops off. Literally just take bombs and blow the peak off, and then they'd drop a bulldozer which would flatten the top, just big enough the size of a football field. So that's the way ours was about 100 yards long and about 50 yards wide. And that 50 yards wide was necessary because maybe it was actually less than 50 because we had to land a Chinook, the 30-passenger big helicopter, and it used to just fit. And that was for transporting 30 men at a time versus the helicopter Hueys, which would take about maybe 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 at a time. So the fire base would be on top of there, and it would have a lot of artificial and temporary aircraft landing material, which was metal, and it would fabricate a runway. Well, we weren't landing any jets. We were just landing helicopters. There would also be another little pad over here made of fabricated steel, and it would land LOH, or light observation helicopters, for the generals and the colonels, who would take these little small helicopters, kind of like the traffic copter that you see on WHIO, even smaller, and they would circle over a combat, over a battle, and the generals would be up there in the battle over there with that helicopter, observing the battle and conducting it from the air in those little helicopters, while the Hueys were dropping the men in, and the Chinooks were taking combat information out. So then one by one, with sky crane helicopters and Chinooks and Hueys, we drop equipment in. We get radios, ammunition, combat containers, big metal containers, small computers. I call them small because they had small power. We had a computer that conducted our artillery. All this equipment come in, so we would divide it. So the infantry would be at one end of the mountain. I would be in the infantry, one of the mountain with my battalion commander, sergeants, lieutenants, corporals, majors, rangers, tough guys, some lifers, and the rest of us were basically waiting to get out of the army, but doing our job. And the other end would be artillery. These were men who were trained in artillery. My job was at night, called the base commander. And my job at night would be to be in one of these containers with radios to coordinate with the men on the field. A corporal in the field would take commands from a captain or a platoon leader, being a lieutenant, and say, okay, call in our coordinates. We're at such and such longitude, such and such latitude, drop this number of munitions in this area, circle us, protect us from the enemy who's out there waiting to get us at night. So my job was then to coordinate with a command sergeant major, who was one of my assistants, and two corporals all through the night, find out exactly where that location was, plot it, and then relay that information to the other end of our hill to the artillery people, who used 155, 105 howitzer cannons to literally launch cannon fire into those areas and protect our men all night long. Can you imagine sleeping, trying to sleep, and around you is this war going on? Once in a while, the guys would call in a wrong coordinate. You've heard of friendly fire. To my knowledge, I've never landed a munition into the middle of one of our own soldiers, but I did hear a lot of screaming at times when those coordinates were real close, and they saw them lightening up within 100 feet of them. We would also coordinate with the particular aircraft with rocket-propelled rockets on helicopters that would circle the area. They'd blow out holes into the mountains around us. They'd see something with a big searchlight, shoot rockets right into that hole. If there's anything moving, a squirrel, a man, a chipmunk, whatever it was gone. And that was the kind of way we did. We were never involved in napalm. This is after the napalm and Agent Orange things were found to be terrible for American soldiers. So that was after that period of time. Now we're using straight munitions. The fire base would take attacks from crudely made mortar shells from the Viet Cong and the regular North Vietnamese army. They would take once in a while some rocket attacks from handheld grenade launchers. There were bad aims. The worst thing we would take was our garbage. Men and women, mostly, but obviously all men on our fire base, we would have garbage, and we'd throw it over the side of our hill. And it would just be laying back there behind the latrine. And it's just like any place else. You throw your garbage over the hill. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong figured out that people think there are rats crawling up through that garbage. So we'd hear a noise at night, we think it's rats. Viet Cong would be crawling up through our garbage. And they could lay satchel charges right in the latrine, for that matter, but anywhere else. And so those things you had to be very suspicious about and careful how you dealt with your garbage. The Viet Cong could take a tuna fish can or a juice can, and they could make it into a personnel mine, or make it into a rocket launcher, or make it into a grenade, or make it into a mortar. They could make anything out of anything. Bad aim, but if they hit anything, it would just be terrible. So you're dealing with a very unconventional army. And people who didn't care, like much of the people we've dealt with recently, they were dying for the purpose, or dying because they were really, really high on opium. A lot of Viet Cong were very high on opium and sent in for their life. Just lose your life for the cause. And drilled by communist leaders who said, go or we'll kill you, don't come back. So you're facing some pretty strange people in a war. And so my day job was that. My night job was that. I would sleep in a bunker which was covered with sandbags and a metal next to the mortar firers in the morning. And they'd fire mortars all morning, but I slept like a baby because you were protected. You have a great sense of security. And at noon, I would get up, so I had 5 hours. And then I would coordinate with my platoon during the daytime, do communication. We ran radio control all around the fire base, communication with the other fire bases, and microwave communication with brigades and battalions back in Da Nang. So during the daytime, you're laying wire and you're communicating and you're working in the fire bases and you're working in the foxholes and you're rebuilding all day long and expecting things to change, working with generators for power to generate the power for the computer. And then at night, back into the same old rhythm again of running the fire base for nighttime combat. I was a first lieutenant. As soon as I walked in country, I had already had orders drawn for me to be a first lieutenant. All of us who were smart knew that you come in country, you weren't going to be an orange or a yellow barred, golden bar second lieutenant anymore, you're going to be a first lieutenant. I'd been commissioned in officer candidate school 6 months at Fort Benning, and I was ready for a first lieutenant about 6 months later. Combat elevation to a rank was very fast in Vietnam. I would have gone to captain if I'd been there for another year probably, but that was short-lived. They didn't need as many captains or lieutenants after that. And they all asked us to, to stay after 1 year in Vietnam, and most of us were convinced we were better civilians than we were soldiers in my case, and determined to be civilians. And certainly, so in '72 when I got a chance to get out, every year, you maybe have heard the famous thing called Tet. In 1968, in the month of February, we had the horrible attack called Tet. And this country suffered the most media coverage of the most awful battles of the North Vietnamese Viet Cong attacking an embassy in Saigon. Our embassy, American embassy. Basically a lot of civilians, CIA, and governmental people. It was shocking. We never thought that they would happen that way. And also Khe Sanh up in the north, a terrible battle. Men lost, body bags on television. Walter Cronkite, who had said before the war is cool, and now saying it's time to say we did the best we could and come home. And at that point, Tet was every year a momentous point. If you could get out of country before February Tet, fine, leave, if you had orders cut. But if your orders were for March and you couldn't get out, you stayed maybe till March or April, because the Tet battle was going to last for weeks. So just before Tet in 1972, I cut orders. My job then was a protocol officer in another command area called Pleiku. I had orders cut. I had a chance to get out. This was worked all the way up through my commanders, General Westmoreland, right up probably through the president who signs everything like that. And I made my way through Air Force, Marine, Navy, and Army vehicles and planes, including Gooneybergs, down to South Vietnam and Saigon. And Ben Hoa Airport, waited 2 days, slept on the floor of my duffel bag, and headed out of country. And that was an individual thing. You think about whole groups coming over in ships, this way. You came over in a plane and you left individually. Any way you could get out of there. And never looked back, believe me, in that whole time. So that was an experience that I hold dear, but I have a great deal of respect for those who literally put their lives on the line a lot more than I did during that time. Questions?
Was there anything that you thought about back home or anything that really got you through it when you got really down and were just I don't know if I can do this?
I was very fortunate in that particular way. My mother had passed away when I was still in college. My dad had remarried. My sister was off on her own career. I had no ties. The girlfriend situation we'd made amicable partings, and so there was no tie back home that was that deep. My dad had been a captain in World War II. There was the idea of do your job right on through. Nothing ever. I didn't have a sense of deep regard or concern about anything back home. So I was very, very fortunate. I looked at it as an opportunity. I was safe. Didn't face the face-to-face combat like the guys down in the swamp, and did not have that treacherous experience. Thank God.
What would you say the greatest emotion you had was, the most overwhelming that you had, and the most awful?
Well, it's interesting. By '68, like I said, there was a turning against the war gradually. Of course, we didn't leave till '74. Well, I was in Memphis, Tennessee, and the fact that I was in Memphis, Tennessee is very conservative, very from the South. My dad was in the service. I went in without any second thoughts. I went through my training in the United States was a whole lot scarier than my experience in Vietnam. I was at Fort Polk, Louisiana, which is called the armpit of the nation, and by some people, down in the swamps of Louisiana, and we had a replica of Vietnam training camp called Tigerland. And the training we had was so realistic that's where fear would be built into you, and respect. Then in OCS, I trained for 6 months in Fort Benning and in the swamps, or the area around Fort Benning, Georgia. And there too, they made it extremely realistic. You've probably seen film of guys training, diving under concertina wire, hopping over, jumping obstacle courses, shooting, firing tracers going over your head. That was terrifying. The next thing that was terrifying is the fact that my platoon, when I was in training, every Friday we'd list each of us in our platoon in our training at Fort Benning. The guy that was on the list of the majority of lists was gone. And in 2 weeks he was probably in a foxhole in Vietnam. So when I got over there, I figured I was trained and ready. And the only thing that I ever felt concerned about was the people. They didn't understand why we're there. We didn't understand why we were there. And you only knew that after a while when you really got to know them. And you found that their lives were basically whoever's in country, who's ever running the place, if it's French Indochina, if it's American, if it's communist, whoever feeds us is fine. And you thought, this is a very sad situation. They'll never understand democracy. They'll never understand the process or even have a desire to have it. And that was probably the most alarming experience.
What did you do in the days and weeks after service?
After the service. Just sharing this with my wife this morning, because she wasn't part of my life at the time either. I got back into Oakland. We came back on the West Coast. We were discharged through a number of days, paperwork, debriefing, so forth, making sure you weren't carrying anything in country that you weren't supposed to have. And then I walked around Oakland and walked around parts of San Francisco, and this was still a little bit of the hippie age. So here I am in my short haircut and military body and hanging out with the hippies. And just observing life, and said, well, I get to look forward to this. I get to grow my hair, put some hair on my face. And so I was looking forward to it, and that's what I did. And I got back to Memphis, Tennessee. I could have taken my old job, but I was a television producer director for NBC in Memphis prior to that. I could have had my job back. They're required to give it back. But I said, it's too hot. I've been in Vietnam. It's hotter than blazes. It's too hot in Memphis. I waited around until my MG was ready. Lieutenants make good money. Bought my MG. Hopped in that dude and headed for New York, and lived in Buffalo, and went back into broadcasting. Didn't have the MG for more than a year because in snow it don't go. Yeah. Other question?
Did you make any close friends when you were in the service?
Interesting too, because I was relating this to my wife. I can see some faces. I can't remember any names. And I do remember having some close friends at Fort Bragg, which was my duty station before I went to Vietnam. Relatively close friends, because we hung out. We went to the officers' club, we went to the movies, and this kind of a thing. We worked together in our office work. Sidelight here, one of my best friends probably was a guy that worked on the Jane Fonda routine. I was a public information officer at Fort Bragg before I went to Vietnam. That means I had a camera and I wrote stories for the Post newspaper. My major job was in charge of riot control in case Jane Fonda visited. Jane Fonda was known to a riot, anti-war, wherever she went. She was Hanoi Jane. She had been very bad in her judgment, caused some serious pain to some of our POWs in North Vietnam. Everywhere she went in this country, she would start a riot. They would just naturally develop. And so we were told if she would visit our compound, our post, we had men trained already to go out and deal with the public and the soldiers who perhaps would be inclined to believe that. And so I dealt with that. That particular aspect was a very strange thing, but through that I developed friends because we had this weird sense of humor about Jane Fonda. So when I got over to Vietnam, though, the guys became your best buddies. Usually we're at E7. In E7, if you have any parents here in the service, they're the guys that really run the war, and they protect your butt. And I had a very, very close E7 who was about 6 years older than me, and he was like my mentor. And that man I'll never forget.
Do you keep in touch with him?
No, I don't. In fact, a couple of guys I kept in touch with were back from Fort Bragg, and then we really diversed in our lifestyles tremendously, and you do that over time. You begin to have friends that you're close to for other reasons. So, I got pictures, but I don't know about them.
What did you do for entertainment in Vietnam? Was there anything you had at all that kept you occupied, or?
Oh yeah. I'm not a card playing guy, but I'll tell you, I learned how to play poker the first week on and I was a new guy at it, and they said I had luck, or beginner's luck, and it ran out about 1 week later, and I quit that. So that was all over. They knew Lieutenant made money, they wanted some of it. On the fire base, because I was this base commander, I also had connections back with the rear area and the signal people. and we borrowed to a supply manager. A supply sergeant is your best friend in the Army. We got a projector, a regular old movie projector, and we hustled that baby up on a helicopter and installed it on the fire base, ran it off, power off of our generator, draped tent canvas all over the place so it would be dark. And at night, we're not supposed to have lights on the base, but we cover the place in black tarp and run our generator at half power, just enough to run the movie projector. And I'd collect 50 cents for everybody that came to the movies. That was my little side money there. And so we did that. That was entertainment. Back in the rear area, you had Officers Club. They had films and USO. I saw probably a dozen USO shows while I was over there. Australians would come, Americans. Round eyes, you gals, round eyes. Over there, we're all used to the Asian appearance, the smaller, different eye formation. We saw a round-eyed girl. You just stared at their eyes. I mean, you got around to the rest of the anatomy later, but boy, those eyes were really something. It was just entertaining to look at one, especially if they were blonde.
Did you ever keep a diary, or did you ever write anything down, or have you chosen to write any memoirs?
Memoirs are all in letters who were sent back to relatives of mine who they were eventually given to me before they all died, and I have those at home. Those nights in that base commander, after we'd settled down 2 hours of artillery fire, got to be rather long. And so you wrote long letters, like legal-sized paper, handwritten, no laptops or anything. And my handwriting was much better, if those of you know me. So those, yes. And I think that was probably for the most part, positive information about myself and about the outlook on I worked with and the people that were my commanding officers. I had a lot of respect for those guys. They were rangers. These guys in the middle of the night, we'd have once in a while like an 18, 16-year-old, 17-year-old guy in a foxhole on the outside who maybe had a little bit of too much grass in the rear area. Now he's out on a fire base trying to dry out, and he's got an M16 or an M60 machine gun. And he's out there in his foxhole in the middle of the night and he sees shadows. Well, all of a sudden he sees lots of shadows. He sees enemy. He doesn't see anybody. And he starts firing 180 degrees. Of course, the guys in the other foxholes are getting a little nervous. And so all of a sudden, one night we got a call from the guys in the fire foxholes next to him. It says, we're under fire from our own guy. Get this guy out of here. And I tell you, the major, who was a ranger, shirtless, could overhear that. This guy never slept. He must have had one eye open all the time. He heard that. I ran up to him. I said, "Sir," man, this guy ran the full length of the fire base and literally dove and tackled this guy who sprayed in the place with the machine gun fire. And he goes, boom! And that took care of that. I had a lot of respect for that major. I was running behind him, and by the time I got there, it was no problem. And my battalion commander was a guy, here's a colonel. We'd barely wear any insignia because you didn't want the enemy to know you were an officer because you were a prime target. Colonel was just as tough and never wore a shirt unless the general was visiting. And these guys were just cool. They were all for one, one for all. And that body of guys just never let anybody down. And it was the way to live. It's great.
Was there something special you did for good luck?
For what?
For good luck.
Good luck. Good luck, yeah. Well, I wasn't much of a praying guy back then, but I remember there were some moments when I certainly learned how to. And I probably, if there was any sense of, if you want to use luck in that particular aspect, that probably would have been. I think it relied mostly on reflex. You were trained so well, so long, that you had automatic reflexes. In fact, a lot of Vietnam guys who were in the worst situations and a lot of ammunition coming at them in their life, you'll hear about shell shock. And I was with guys that if they're working under their car and somebody dropped a wrench, they'd come out from under that car and come swinging. And that had to be dealt with in a lot of guys' lives. So we worked by reflex. I think that was your best dependent, reflex. Yeah. Did the right thing, hopefully.
Do you feel comfortable sharing all this with your daughters and your wife?
It's interesting. I pulled out the pictures years and years ago. And we moved so many times I couldn't find the pictures when they were old enough to understand it. When I met my wife in '74, 2 years later, realized the Vietnam War had been a sour point in our history. We left there with our tails between our legs. It was not an experience which we were proud of. I got no negative reaction from people because I'd been there. I never talked about it. It was like I'd been away on another job for a couple of years, and I was back, resumed my income and my job. And So you didn't talk about it unless you occasionally came into a vet. You talked for about 5 minutes, where were you, what'd you do, and then you're on to other things. So it never came up in my kids' lives. Once in a while they asked questions when they got into high school, you know, because we studied the war, Dad, what'd you do? And, you know, after about 10 minutes of me talking like I'm talking here, you know, they all went and turned the TV on and watched the real war or something. It's a strange thing. There are not the emblem of a strategic win and victory like there was in World War II. So we dads are not seen as something that they are curious about. I don't know if many do share that with great detail, except if they're under a lot of emotional strain, and they probably share it. Mine was just 2 years away at another job, and I guess they're proud of their dad that, you know, that he fathered them, and that didn't have any repercussions from serving in Vietnam. So maybe that's the benefit.
Do you think you're given the same respect as a World War II vet would be given, or do you think that sometimes the Vietnam War is looked upon as it's a, you know, really sour point, and you don't deserve as much, you know, glory as somebody else would?
Yeah, a lot of guys came back and they were proud of what they've done, and they went through the real battle, and they were tough getting jobs. They didn't have skills. And if you didn't have a skill and you hadn't been in Vietnam, there's any sense that you had any problem, emotional or drug-oriented or otherwise, you got looked down on. And it took a long time for Vietnam vets to get respect. I never experienced that. Never did, not a moment that I'm aware of. I don't think I looked like a vet. I mean, I didn't wear the fatigues. Guys wear fatigues. It wasn't my thing. I was very fortunate in that way. I wasn't able to find employment right off the bat in Buffalo. So I went on a TV show that they had for veterans looking for jobs. And the producer said, "What job do you want?" And I said, "I want yours." And 8 months later, I didn't have his, but I was working for him. I had another job, another station within 2 weeks. And so I felt very happy that I was provided for. I had lots of education. I was trained. A lot of guys didn't have any training. It was real tough. Real tough. Yeah.
Did you say you were in graduate school when you
Yes.
were drafted?
I went to school at Memphis State University, University of Memphis, right out of high school. I told some of you guys that half my classmates went with us. Half of them dropped out first semester, failed out, and ended up in foxholes earlier than we did. I stayed right through. I found broadcasting to be very exciting. Kept me in college. And I went to graduate school on a full ride, and I was also employed at NBC. I was very, very, very fortunate in that particular way. And in graduate school, I was in 1 year, and the U.S. Army said, "Okay, you've had 4 years deferment. That's all we're really allocating. You're not married. You don't have children. You're not an only child. We want you." And so that's tough, though. You come back after being Army trained for 3 years and try to go back to graduate school. I mean, it's demanding because you haven't had to do anything really thought processing for a few years. You're all reflex. You know, like, give me a gun, I'll do it. So I didn't go back to graduate school till years later. That was and it puts you behind in your career because you're going to be, you know, this academic person. You think? Surprise, surprise. So if you go to college, go right to graduate school right away. Don't get out of the mood here.
Do you feel that you were in a different state of mind when you were in Vietnam, or do you feel that you were really pretty much the same?
Only by the training. You were trained to be a soldier at Fort Bragg, Fort Benning, same place Lieutenant Calley was trained, who was the famous My Lai incident. I was the same training, although not as, by that time they said, you know, we've got to make sure you guys don't do anything careless. So your reflex worked for you, but I don't remember having a state of mind that was different. I think I worked with the guys that I had to command the same way that I would work with a group of factory workers who I might be the foreman for back here. I don't believe so, and I don't remember one moment of anti-Army, anti-what we're doing while I was there. That's a good experience. Of course, we didn't have newspapers and television telling us what was going on back home, so you're not given that. Yeah.
When was it that you realized that they were so against what was going on in Vietnam? People
Well, again, coming out of Memphis, which was pretty much pro-military, probably years later, probably when I started teaching it. I started teaching in college in 1982, and I taught communication history. And in communication history, I talked about how we cover wars. And So and we'd also had the we'd had the Iran hostage situation too, and there were a lot of questions about how we deal with this. And at that point, I began to really study what Walter Cronkite had said in 1968. And then I really looked at that film of us leaving on that helicopter in 1974, and we lost 50,000 American guys dead. And I thought, from that time on, I said, that's something we'll never repeat. We dare not ever repeat that. So when we went into Iraq this time, it was in for the kill. And that's the way it has to be, or just don't bother playing war. That's how I felt. Any more questions about entertainment?